when 26-year-old German POW Klaus Brandt stepped off a truck in Pennsylvania weighing only 119 pounds, he expected the brutality of the enemy. Instead, he encountered a master carpenter who didn't see a prisoner, but a craftsman, and a standard so demanding it would change his life forever. Redo it until it's right. But while Klaus was meticulously framing a school for American children, a single letter from the Red Cross revealed a heartbreaking irony that threatened to shatter his new world. What was the forbidden secret hidden in Klaus's hands that an ocean of war couldn't erase? And why did a tiny 32nd of an inch become the ultimate measure of his humanity? The truck slowed at 2:47 in the afternoon. Klaus Brandt knew the time because he had been watching a crack in the canvas since Ohio. He counted seconds when the road was smooth. He lost count when it wasn't. But he had a rough accounting of the hours, and the hours told him it was mid-afternoon when central Pennsylvania first appeared through the gap in the tailgate. He was 26 years old. He weighed 119 pounds. He had been captured in Tunisia 14 months earlier, and had spent those months in a succession of British holding camps that shared two qualities: insufficient food and complete indifference to the difference between those two things. He was not starving in the clinical sense. He was simply less than he had been, his body having consumed itself in increments over 14 months, until what remained was functional but reduced, the way a candle is functional until it isn't. Ernst Weber sat across from him on the bench. Ernst was 31 and from Dresden, and had the angular, deliberate quality of a man who had decided early that efficiency was the only reasonable response to a world that wasted everything else. He had been a mechanic before the war. He could diagnose an engine by sound. He applied this same diagnostic attention to everything around him, including the truck, which he had assessed within the first hour as American military, mid-production, rear suspension, recently replaced. He had shared none of these observations with Klaus because Klaus had not asked and Ernst did not speak without purpose. The truck entered a town. Klaus looked through the gap and saw white houses. He saw porches with chairs on them. He saw a woman hanging laundry in a side yard, her back to the road, unhurried. He saw two children on bicycles moving through an intersection with the absolute confidence of children in a place where intersections are safe. The truck stopped at a traffic light. A man in civilian clothes walked past on the sidewalk. He was carrying paper bags in both arms. He glanced at the truck. He saw the P stenciled on the canvas. He kept walking. No fear, no anger, just a glance. Klaus watched him disappear around a corner. He looked at Ernst. Ernst was watching the same corner with the same expression he used for engine diagnostics. Neutral. Processing. The light changed. The truck moved on. 5 miles north of town, the road became dirt, and the truck turned through a gate. Klaus looked at the gate and looked at the fence beyond it and counted the guard towers. 4 towers. 2 guards per tower. 8 guards total. He did the arithmetic without deciding to. 120 prisoners in this transport alone. He had heard the camp held over 1,000. 8 guards for over 1,000 prisoners. The math was wrong. Or his understanding of something was wrong. He filed this without conclusion and watched the camp assemble itself through the tailgate gap as the truck rolled through. Wooden barracks in straight rows. A large building that was probably the mess hall. A smaller building that was probably administration. Athletic fields that were definitely athletic fields because there was a baseball diamond with actual bases, and beyond the diamond, a library building with a small painted sign. He could not read from this distance, but that was clearly a library because it had the proportions of a library, the proportions of a place that held books rather than people. The truck stopped. The tailgate dropped. They were processed in the administration building. Name, rank, number, medical examination. A doctor listened to Klaus's chest with a stethoscope and looked at his teeth and pressed 2 fingers into the soft tissue below his ribs and said something to the orderly in English. The orderly translated. The doctor said Klaus was underweight but otherwise sound and that this would be corrected. Klaus noted the word corrected. It implied intention. It implied that someone had decided his weight was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be managed. The German uniforms were collected. American work clothing was issued in exchange. Cotton trousers, a denim shirt, sturdy boots that had been worn before but resoled recently. Klaus held the shirt and felt the weight of the cotton, which was heavier than any fabric he had worn in 2 years. He put it on. It fit across the shoulders, which meant someone had looked at him before selecting the size. He was assigned to Barracks 7, Bunk 14. He walked across the compound carrying a blanket, a pillow, a towel, and a bar of soap. The soap was pale yellow and smooth. He stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the compound path and looked at the soap. Ernst walked into him from behind. Klaus apologized without looking up. He was looking at the soap. It was real soap, not the compressed gray compound that had passed for soap in the British camps. Not the rationed quarter bar that his mother had stretched across an entire month in Hamburg. Real soap with weight and smoothness and the faint, clean smell of something made with actual fat and actual intention. Ernst looked at the soap. He said nothing. He resumed walking. The barracks had wooden floors. The windows had screens. Each end of the long room held a coal stove, unlit now in June but present, waiting for Pennsylvania winter with the patient readiness of a stove that had been doing this for years. Klaus found Bunk 14 and sat on it and pressed his hand into the mattress. It compressed under his weight and slowly expanded back. Real stuffing. Not straw. Not canvas over a wooden frame. Actual interior material that responded to the body above it with something approaching accommodation. Ernst took Bunk 15. He sat on his mattress and looked at the pillow. He picked it up and set it down. He picked it up again. He set it down again. He looked at the wall. Klaus said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the pillow had not already said more precisely. The bell rang at 5:30. They followed the other prisoners to the mess hall. It was a large building with long tables and overhead lights that were already on against the early evening dimness, and it smelled of things cooking, real things, animal fat and starch, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been working since morning. Klaus moved through the serving line with a metal tray. American soldiers in white aprons stood behind the counter. The first one put 2 pieces of fried chicken on the tray. The second added mashed potatoes. The third added green beans. The fourth added a roll with butter. The fifth added a slice of apple pie. Klaus stopped moving. The man behind him in line said something. Klaus moved forward. He found a table with Ernst and 4 other men from the transport and sat down. Nobody spoke. They looked at the trays. One of the men, a corporal named Friedrich, made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when the body overrides the mind's capacity for language. If you are enjoying this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new video. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from. They ate. Klaus finished everything in 9 minutes. His stomach hurt immediately. The pain was not illness. It was the protest of a digestive system that had been operating on reduced inputs for 14 months and had just received a full load without warning. Friedrich pushed back from the table and put his head in his hands. He had eaten too fast. His body was processing the protest loudly. Ernst ate slowly and steadily and finished last and said that he had not had butter since 1942. Klaus said he had not had pie since before the war. Ernst nodded. They returned their trays and walked back to the barracks in the late evening light. The Pennsylvania sky was still bright at 7:30 in the way that summer skies are bright in places that are not burning, and Klaus looked at it for a moment before going inside. The blue of it, the specific untroubled blue of a sky above a country that was not being bombed that evening, or any recent evening, a blue that had no smoke in it, no particulate from destroyed things, just sky. He lay on bunk 14 and felt the mattress receive him and thought about Hamburg. His mother was in Hamburg. His younger brother was in Hamburg. He had received one letter from his mother since capture, delivered by the Red Cross in February, written on paper so thin it was nearly translucent. She had said his brother was in school. She had not mentioned food. She had not mentioned the bombing raids that Klaus knew from the British camp newspapers he had been permitted to read in fragments, had been systematic and sustained. She had not mentioned these things because she was protecting him from them, which was what his mother did, which was what she had always done. which was not a comfort, but its own form of information. He thought about the 5 soldiers in white aprons behind the counter. He thought about the quantity of food on the tray and the fact that the quantity had been unremarkable to the men who put it there, had been the standard quantity, the expected quantity, the quantity that this place produced for every man every evening without apparent strain. He thought about the blue sky through the barracks window above his bunk. He did not think about escape. This surprised him when he noticed it. He had imagined, in the abstract planning that prisoners do in the first weeks of captivity, that he would assess every new facility for vulnerabilities, that this would be instinctive, that the soldier's training would assert itself automatically. Instead, he was lying on a real mattress beneath a real pillow and thinking about the blue sky and the white aprons and the soap that was real soap. And the thought that came was not, how do I leave, but where did this come from? And the answer to that question was going to take considerably longer than one evening to arrive at. Ernst said from the next bunk, in the dark, that 8 guards for over 1,000 men was not a security configuration. It was a statement. Klaus asked what kind of statement. Ernst said he was still working that out. Klaus said so was he. They said nothing further. Outside, the Pennsylvania night settled over the camp with the same unhurried completeness as the evening had settled over the town. The white houses, the woman hanging laundry, the man with the paper bags, who had glanced at the truck and kept walking, because the truck was simply a truck, and the day was simply a Tuesday, and the town was simply a town where nothing was required of a person except to move through it in the direction they were already going. Klaus closed his eyes. He had arrived weighing 119 pounds. He did not know what he would weigh when this was over. He did not know what over meant yet. He only knew that the mattress was real and the soap was real, and the sky above the camp had been an untroubled blue, and that these 3 facts were going to require more explanation than anything he had been given so far had prepared him to provide. The commandant addressed the new arrivals on the second morning. Colonel Hargrove was 51 years old and a career officer. He spoke with the measured clarity of a man who had given this speech before and refined it to its essential information. He stood in the main yard in full uniform. The prisoners stood in formation. A sergeant from Milwaukee translated, his German precise and slightly formal, the German of a man who had learned it from his grandparents rather than from the street. Hargrove said prisoners would work 6 days per week. Sunday was rest. Work assignments included agriculture, forestry, and light construction. Payment was 80 cents per day in canteen script. The script was valid at the camp canteen for cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and beer. Prisoners who demonstrated good conduct would be designated trustees. Trustees received additional privileges including supervised work details in town. The camp had a library, a recreation hall, athletic fields, English and mathematics classes beginning the following Monday. Any prisoner caught attempting escape would be confined to the stockade for 30 days. Hargrove finished and left. The Milwaukee sergeant remained for questions. Nobody asked any. The prisoners stood in the yard and processed what they had heard with the collective silence of men whose capacity for surprise had just been exceeded by a significant margin. Ernst said quietly, from the corner of his mouth, that there was beer. Klaus said he had heard. Ernst said 80 cents per day. Klaus said he had heard that too. Ernst said nothing further. He was doing arithmetic. Klaus could tell by the stillness of his eyes. Work assignments were posted the following morning on the barracks door. Klaus read his name on the agricultural detail. 20 prisoners, 2 guards, 1 truck. They drove 15 miles south on a state road through Pennsylvania farmland that looked nothing like any landscape Klaus had previously inhabited. The fields were large and organized. The farmhouses sat back from the road behind screens of old trees. The sky was enormous. There were no bombed buildings, no burned fields. The countryside looked the way the countryside in photographs looked, before the events that made photographs necessary. The farm belonged to a man named Robert Mitchell. Mitchell was 63 years old and lean and weathered in the specific way of men who work outdoors in every season for decades. His 2 sons were in the army, one in France, one in the Pacific. He needed the harvest brought in. He met the truck at the edge of the cornfield and looked at the 20 prisoners without hostility or warmth, the practical assessment of a man who needed work done and was evaluating whether the workers could do it. The guard stayed with the truck. Mitchell walked into the field and the prisoners followed. He showed them what was needed: cut the corn, bundle the stalks, load the bundles onto the wagon. He demonstrated once with the economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times and had removed every unnecessary motion from the sequence. Then he moved to the far end of the row and began working. Klaus took his position and began cutting. The work was physical and repetitive. It occupied the body completely, which meant it occupied the mind at least partially, which was an improvement over the camps where there had been nothing to do. There the mind had worked itself over the same small inventory of fears and memories until they were worn smooth from handling. Here there was the resistance of the corn, the weight of the bundles, the heat of the Pennsylvania morning, the specific ache of muscles being asked to perform at full capacity for the first time in 14 months. Mitchell provided water every 2 hours. He carried it himself from the farmhouse in a metal pail with a ladle. He moved along the working line and offered it to each man without distinction. Klaus drank and handed the ladle back. Mitchell moved to Ernst without looking up. At noon, Mitchell's wife came from the farmhouse with lunch. She set it on a table near the truck without speaking. Sandwiches and wax paper, apples, a jug of lemonade with ice still floating in it. She looked at the prisoners once with the neutral expression of a woman who had been told this was happening and had decided to feed them because her husband had asked, and because feeding people was what you did regardless of the circumstances. Then she went back to the farmhouse. Klaus unwrapped his sandwich: white bread, thick-cut ham, yellow mustard. He ate it in 4 bites and was ashamed of the speed. He slowed down for the apple. He drank the lemonade and tasted the cold of it all the way down. Ernst said the mustard was American mustard. Klaus said yes. Ernst said it was different from German mustard. Klaus said it was. Ernst considered this and went back to eating. That was the extent of their conversation about the sandwich. But Klaus understood that Ernst was doing what they were both doing: filing information. The mustard, the ice in the lemonade, the table set without being asked, the wife who had looked at them once and fed them anyway, adding it to the account, waiting for the account to tell them something. At the end of the day, Mitchell walked to each prisoner and paid them their 80 cents in canteen script. He counted it from a small canvas pouch and placed it in each man's hand individually. He looked briefly at the face above the hand as he did. The guard translated his words as, "Thank you for the work." Then Mitchell walked back to his barn without looking back. Klaus stood in the cornfield with 80 cents in his hand. He looked at the script. He looked at the field they had worked. He looked at the farmhouse where the wife had returned to her life. He looked at Ernst, who was looking at his own 80 cents with the expression he used for engine problems requiring careful thought before diagnosis. Ernst said that Mitchell had looked at them when he paid them. Klaus said he had noticed. Ernst said he had looked at each one. Klaus said yes. They rode back to camp with the windows down and the Pennsylvania evening coming in warm and green-smelling. The fields moved past in low golden light. Klaus felt the day's work in his shoulders and his hands. He felt the 80 cents in his pocket. He thought about his father. His father had been a cabinet maker in Hamburg. He had died in 1937 from a lung condition the doctor attributed to years of fine sawdust. He had been 44 years old. He had paid his apprentices on Fridays from a small canvas pouch kept in the left drawer of his workbench, counting the coins out individually and looking at each man's face as he placed them in the hand. Klaus had watched him do this every Friday of his apprenticeship. He had been 17 when his father died. He had not finished the apprenticeship. He had not thought about the canvas pouch in years. He said nothing to Ernst because there was nothing Ernst could do with the information. Dinner that evening was pork chops, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread, chocolate cake. Klaus ate everything. His stomach no longer hurt when he finished. His body was adjusting to the quantity with the pragmatic efficiency of a body that does not ask whether abundance is deserved but simply processes it and builds from it. He was gaining weight. He could feel it in the way his clothing fit differently. The shoulders of the denim shirt no longer hanging past the actual width of him. After dinner, the canteen opened. Klaus went with Ernst. The canteen was a long wooden room with shelves behind a counter, staffed by an American private who could not have been older than 19. The shelves held cigarettes, candy bars, toiletries, 2 brands of beer, playing cards, and writing paper. Writing paper. Klaus bought 2 sheets and an envelope, 6 cents of his 80. He took the paper back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and looked at it for a long time. He knew what not to say. He would not mention the pork chops. He would not mention the chocolate cake or the 80 cents or the ice in the lemonade or the mattress or the real soap. He would not describe the wooden floors or the screened windows. He would not mention the library or the athletic fields or the English classes beginning Monday. He would say he was healthy. He would say he was working. He would say he hoped to see her soon. He wrote these things in the careful small handwriting his father had made him practice for 3 years. Because precise handwriting was part of the craft. Because a man who built things precisely also wrote precisely. Because precision was not a habit applied selectively, but a way of operating in the world that either held or didn't. He folded the paper into the envelope, wrote his mother's Hamburg address, and set it on the shelf above his bunk. Ernst watched him from the next bunk and said nothing. Klaus looked at the envelope and thought about his mother reading it in the Hamburg apartment. Reading the words healthy and working, and hoped to see her soon. Believing them. Being glad of them. Not knowing what surrounded them. Not knowing what the words had been chosen to hide. He thought about whether this was kindness or cowardice. He did not arrive at a conclusion. He turned off the light above his bunk. He lay back and listened to the Pennsylvania night through the screened window. Somewhere in the camp, someone was playing a harmonica, a German folk melody, slow and unsentimental, played by someone not trying to feel anything but simply filling the evening because the instrument was there. Klaus listened until the music stopped. Then he looked at the stars through the screen mesh. There were more of them than a Hamburg childhood had prepared him for. The sky here was dark enough to show what it actually contained. Nothing burning beneath it. Nothing bright enough to wash it out. Just stars, in the quantity that stars exist when left alone, which was a quantity that turned out to be considerable. He looked at them until his eyes grew heavy. Then he closed them and slept. The trustee designation came in late July. The camp sergeant called Klaus to the administration building on a Tuesday morning and explained what the status meant. Klaus would be permitted to leave camp daily for work assignments without direct supervision. He would carry a work permit. He would return each evening by 6 o'clock. Failure to return would result in loss of trustee status and 30 days in the stockade. The sergeant slid the permit across the desk. Klaus picked it up. It was a single sheet of paper. His name, his prisoner number, a stamp, a signature. It stated that the bearer was authorized to work off-site and was to be afforded reasonable cooperation by civilian authorities. A piece of paper. That was all. The sergeant pointed to a truck waiting outside the gate. Klaus walked through the gate alone. No escort, no handcuffs, no guard with a rifle 3 steps behind. Just the permit in his hand and the truck idling on the other side of the fence and the Pennsylvania morning already warm at 7 o'clock. He stopped on the other side of the gate and stood for a moment. He was not sure why he stopped. His body had paused without consulting him. He stood on the free side of the fence and looked at the road ahead and at the fields beyond the road and at the sky above the fields. Then he got in the truck. The mill was 12 miles west of camp. It sat at the edge of a stand of second-growth timber, a long, low building of corrugated metal with a yard full of stacked lumber drying in the sun and a smell of cut wood that reached the truck before the building did. The sharp green smell of freshly milled timber, and beneath it the older, drier smell of seasoned wood and sawdust and machine oil. Klaus stepped out of the truck and breathed it in and felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately identify. Then he identified it. It was recognition. His father's workshop had smelled like this. The mill foreman was a man named James Carroll. Carroll was 53 years old and had served in France in 1918 and had the specific quality of stillness that certain men carry after combat. Not trauma exactly, but an adjustment of scale, a recalibration of what qualified as serious. He had been running this mill for 19 years. He treated the 6 German trustees the same way he treated his civilian workers. He showed them their stations. He explained the work. He expected it done correctly. He did not explain himself further. Klaus's job was to stack cut lumber for drying. Each plank had to be placed with precision. Spacing consistent, ends aligned. The stacks built true so the wood dried evenly without warping. Careless stacking meant warped lumber. Warped lumber meant waste. Carroll did not discuss waste as a concept. He simply pointed at a warped plank from a previous stack and let the plank explain itself. Klaus stacked carefully. He had been stacking for 20 minutes when he realized he was applying his father's standards without deciding to. Even spacing. True ends. The stack rising plank by plank with the same incremental care his father had brought to every surface of every piece he had ever built. His father had said that the quality of a thing was determined at every step, not only the final one. That a joint cut carelessly could not be saved by careful finishing. That the work was either honest from the beginning or it was not honest. Klaus stacked the lumber and thought about his father and said nothing. The civilian workers sat at one end of the yard at lunch. The German trustees sat at the other. Nobody crossed the distance. Nobody was hostile about the distance. It was simply the distance that existed between people who did not yet have a reason to cross it, maintained by habit rather than by rule. Klaus ate his camp sandwich and looked at the mill building and listened to the machinery that continued to run through the lunch hour. The deep rhythmic sound of the saw working through timber, steady and indifferent to the hour. This continued for 2 weeks. On the 15th day, a civilian worker named Harold approached during the lunch break. Harold was in his late 40s with a broad face and the careful movements of a man who had worked with his hands long enough to have developed respect for the damage that carelessness could do. He walked to where Klaus was sitting and stood for a moment and then sat on the lumber stack 3 feet away. He did not ask permission. He did not announce himself. He simply sat. He said, "Where are you from?" His English was slow and deliberate. He spoke each word as though checking it before releasing it. Klaus said, "Hamburg." Harold nodded. He looked at the mill building. He said he had a cousin in the Navy, Atlantic. He asked if Klaus had been in the Navy. Klaus said no. Infantry, North Africa, captured at Kasserine Pass. Harold nodded again. He looked at Klaus's hands on the sandwich. He looked at the stack of lumber Klaus had built that morning. He looked back at the mill building. Then he stood up and walked back to the civilian end of the yard. Klaus watched him go. He finished his sandwich. He went back to stacking. The next day, Harold came again. He sat on the same lumber stack. He placed something beside Klaus, a second sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He did not make a ceremony of it. He set it down the way you set something down when the setting down is the entire statement, and anything added to it would diminish it. Klaus looked at the sandwich. He looked at Harold. Harold was looking at the mill building. Klaus said thank you. Harold nodded. They ate. Harold talked about the mill, about his family, about Pennsylvania winters, which he said were serious, which Klaus should be prepared for. Klaus listened and responded when his English was sufficient, and listened more when it wasn't. Harold did not appear bothered by the gaps. He filled them with more information about Pennsylvania winters or the mill or his family's farm 2 counties north, speaking in the slow, deliberate way of a man who had decided to talk and was going to talk at whatever pace the conversation required. By August, Klaus's English had improved considerably. He was attending classes at the camp 3 evenings per week. The instructor was a former high school teacher from Philadelphia, now an Army education officer, a thin man in his 40s named Fletcher, who taught with the particular enthusiasm of a man who believed that language was the primary tool of human civilization and that the acquisition of it was therefore always urgent, regardless of circumstance. He assigned homework. He corrected pronunciation with a small raised hand and a patient repetition of the correct sound. He expected improvement week over week and received it because he expected it, and because his students understood, most of them, that what Fletcher was teaching them was not merely English but access to the newspapers in the camp library, to the conversations happening around them, to the country they were living inside. Klaus practiced with Ernst in the barracks after class. They spoke only in English. They corrected each other's mistakes with the blunt efficiency of men who had no time for false encouragement. The other prisoners in the barracks said they were showing off. Ernst said he didn't care. Klaus said he didn't either. He wanted to read the newspapers. He read them in the library on Sunday mornings, working through the dense columns of English text with the focused effort of someone mining for specific information. He found it. The Allies had landed in Normandy. They were moving across France. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Germany was losing on both fronts simultaneously. He read these articles and felt nothing that surprised him. He had known since Kasserine Pass that Germany would lose, not as a political opinion, as an arithmetic observation. The resources on one side and the resources on the other were not comparable. He had known it and had kept knowing it through the British camps and the transport and the arrival at Camp Reynolds, and every day since. The newspapers confirmed what the arithmetic had already established. What the newspapers also told him, in the spaces between the military reporting, was what Germany had been doing in the occupied territories, what the camps in Poland were, what the trains were for. He read these articles in the camp library on Sunday mornings with the particular quality of attention of a man being told something he cannot immediately integrate into his understanding of the country he had believed himself to be serving. He read them twice. He read the same paragraphs multiple times because reading them once was insufficient for the information they contained, which was not insufficient in volume but in comprehensibility, in the capacity of a person who had grown up in Hamburg and apprenticed to his father and been conscripted at 19 to absorb without rupture what the words were describing. He folded the newspaper carefully when he was done. He returned it to its place on the library shelf. He walked back to the barracks and sat on his bunk and looked at the wall until Ernst came in and asked if he was all right. Klaus said he was reading the newspapers. Ernst said he knew. Ernst said he had been reading them too. Ernst said nothing further, and Klaus said nothing further, and they sat in their respective silences with the information between them like something neither of them had agreed to carry, but were carrying anyway. That evening, Carol stopped Klaus at the end of the workday. The other prisoners had already loaded onto the transport truck. Carol had his hat in his hand and was looking at Klaus's lumber stacks with the assessing eye he brought to all finished work. He walked the length of the nearest stack. He checked the spacing with his fingers at 3 points. He looked at the ends. He looked at the alignment from the far corner. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said the stacking was good, consistent. He asked if Klaus had worked with wood before. Klaus said his father had been a cabinet maker. He had apprenticed for 2 years before his father died. Carol looked at him. He said that explained the hands. He said a man who had learned to hold tools correctly held them correctly for life even after years away from the work. He said he had noticed Klaus's hands on the first day. Klaus did not know what to say to this. Carol put his hat back on and said he would speak to the camp about a different assignment. He walked to his truck and drove away. Klaus stood in the lumber yard in the August evening with the smell of cut wood around him and the sound of the mill machinery winding down for the day. He looked at the stacks he had built. He looked at his hands. His father had said the same thing about hands, that the right way of holding a tool settled into the muscles and stayed there, that you could tell a craftsman by his hands before he picked anything up. Klaus had been 19 when his father said this. He was 26 now and standing in a lumber yard in Pennsylvania, and an American foreman had looked at his hands and seen the same thing his father had seen, had identified something that 14 months of British camps and 119 pounds, and the arithmetic of losing a war had not managed to remove. He loaded onto the transport truck. He rode back to camp. He ate dinner. He went to the library and took out the English grammar book Fletcher had assigned. He read 3 chapters and completed the exercises in the margins in the small, precise handwriting his father had required. Outside the library window, the Pennsylvania summer evening was long and warm and unhurried. Harold's sandwich was still with him somehow. Not the sandwich itself, but the gesture of it, the simplicity of it, the way it had been placed without ceremony because ceremony would have made it something other than what it was, which was one person deciding that another person deserved a sandwich and acting on that decision without requiring any framework larger than the decision itself. Klaus thought about this for a while. Then he turned the page and kept reading. Carroll was as good as his word. The reassignment came through the camp administration on a Monday morning in early September. Klaus was removed from the mill detail and assigned to a civilian construction crew working on a new school building in Altoona. The assignment slip said skilled labor. 2 words. Klaus read them twice and put the slip in his pocket and walked to the truck with the particular steadiness of a man who has received news he was not expecting and has decided to receive it without visible reaction until he has had time to examine it privately. The crew consisted of 8 German trustees and a civilian foreman. The foreman's name was Vincent Caruso. Caruso was 54 years old, second-generation Italian-American, and a master carpenter who had been building things in Altoona for 30 years. He was not a large man, but he had the physical authority of someone whose body had been doing demanding work since adolescence and had developed accordingly. Compact and precise in his movements, his hands permanently stained with the residue of his trade, his eyes carrying the specific quality of attention that craftsmen develop after decades of looking at joints and angles and surfaces for the places where the work was not yet right. He spoke no German. Klaus spoke enough English to translate for the others. Caruso gave his instructions to Klaus. Klaus turned them into German. The crew executed. This arrangement established itself on the first morning without discussion, because it was the obvious arrangement, and Caruso was a man who identified the obvious arrangement and used it without sentiment. He looked at Klaus when he spoke and waited for the translation, and then watched the crew to confirm comprehension before moving to the next instruction. The work was framing the school's second floor. It was skilled labor in the actual sense. Not the institutional sense of the assignment slip, but the genuine sense of work that required understanding the relationship between parts, that required reading a plan and translating it into cuts and joints and connections that would hold weight and distribute load and stand for decades. Caruso had been given Army labor before, and it had produced Army results, which was to say, adequate and no more. He watched Klaus and the other trustees work through the first morning with the assessing patience of a man who had been disappointed before and was calibrating his expectations accordingly. By noon, he had stopped calibrating. He moved among the crew with the quiet efficiency of a foreman who had found his team, making adjustments with his hands rather than his voice, repositioning a board, correcting an angle, tapping a joint into alignment with the heel of his palm. He said little. When he spoke, it was specific. He did not explain the reasoning behind his instructions because the reasoning was visible in the work itself to anyone who was paying the right kind of attention, and he had determined within the first hours that this crew was paying that kind of attention. Klaus worked on the window framing. He had not done this specific work before, but he had watched his father frame a cabinet opening, and he had understood the principle then, that the frame was not decoration but structure, that it bore load, that every dimension mattered because the door or window it would receive was built to those dimensions and would either fit or not fit, and there was no tolerance in the not fitting. He worked with this understanding and measured twice before cutting and cut once and checked the result against the plan. On the third day, Caruso stopped behind him and looked at the window frame Klaus had just completed. He tested the corners with his thumbs. He checked the level. He sighted down the length of it with one eye closed in the way of craftsman checking for true. He was quiet for what felt to Klaus like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Then he said it was close, but the left corner was a 32nd of an inch out of square, and it needed to come apart and be reset. Klaus looked at the corner. He took out his square and measured. Caruso was right. 32nd of an inch, barely visible. Functionally, it would probably hold. The door would likely hang. Most foremen he had worked under in the Army would have passed it. Caruso was not most foremen. Klaus said he would redo it. Caruso nodded and moved to the next man. Klaus dismantled the corner joint and reset it. He worked slowly. He measured at 3 stages of the process, rather than at the end. He checked the square before driving each nail. He checked it after. The corner came together this time with the clean precision of a thing that was exactly what it was supposed to be. The 2 pieces meeting at 90 degrees without deviation, the joint tight, the surfaces flush. He called Caruso over. Caruso tested the corner with his thumbs. He checked the level. He sighted down the length. He took out his own square and measured. He said it was right. Just that. It was right. He moved on. Klaus looked at the corner for a moment. He looked at his hands. He thought about what Carol had said at the mill about hands retaining the correct way of holding a tool. He thought about what it meant that Caruso had expected the 32nd to be corrected rather than accepted, had expected the work to be right rather than adequate, had communicated through that expectation something that went beyond carpentry. He was being held to a standard, not a prisoner's standard, not an adequate standard, a craftsman's standard. The standard that his father had held him to at 17, that his father had held himself to every day of his working life, that any man who worked with wood and called himself a craftsman held himself to regardless of who was watching. The standard that said the work was either right or it was not right, and if it was not right, it needed to be made right, and this was not a punishment but the nature of the craft. Klaus went back to work. The days on the school building developed their own rhythm over the following weeks. The crew arrived at 7. Caruso was always already there, walking the previous day's work in the early morning light with his coffee and his square, checking what had been done, identifying what needed attention before the crew began adding to it. He marked problems with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear and addressed them with Klaus at the start of each day in the brief pre-work review that became the structure around which everything else organized itself. These reviews were the most instructive part of every day. Caruso did not explain his corrections as discipline. He explained them as physics. The load goes here, so the joint needs to be this way. The weather will do this to the wood over 20 years, so the gap needs to be this dimension. The children who use this building will do that to the floor, so the subfloor needs this treatment. He spoke about the building as something that would exist in time, that would be used by people who had no idea it had been built, and would simply expect it to hold, and that this expectation was the craftsman's responsibility, even though the craftsman would never meet the people carrying it. Klaus translated this for the crew each morning. Some of them understood only the immediate instruction. Klaus understood the principle beneath it. He began to see the school not as a project, but as an argument made in wood and nails and careful measurement that said this will stand, that said the people inside it matter, that said the craft is a form of commitment to people you will never know in a future you will not see. His father had made this argument in every piece he had ever built. Ernst visited the site one afternoon on a different work detail passing through. He stopped and looked at the framing going up and looked at Klaus moving along the second floor deck with a nail gun and a plan. He watched for a while. Then he called up and said Klaus looked like a carpenter. Klaus said he was becoming one. Ernst considered this and said that was unexpected. Klaus said many things had been. Ernst's detail moved on. Klaus went back to work. By the end of September, the school's frame was complete. It stood in the September light with the particular rightness of a structure that has been built to its plan. The lines true, the angles square, the whole thing carrying in its geometry the accumulated decisions of every measurement and cut and joint that had gone into it. Caruso walked the frame on the last Friday of the month in his early morning way, and Klaus walked with him because by now this was understood to be part of the process, Klaus as the foreman's second set of eyes. The man who would translate not only language, but judgment. Caruso stopped at the window frame Klaus had redone in the first week. He tested the corner. He said nothing, but the testing itself was a form of acknowledgement, returning to the place where the standard had been established to confirm that the standard had held. It had held. They walked back to the center of the frame, and Caruso looked at the building from the inside out, which was how he always assessed his work. From the interior perspective of the eventual occupant, rather than the exterior perspective of the builder. He said that the school was good. He said the crew had built well. He said he was going to speak to Colonel Hargrove about extending the contract through the winter for the interior finish work. Klaus translated this for the crew. The crew received it with the quiet satisfaction of men who had been told their work was good by a man whose assessment of goodness they had come to trust. That evening, Caruso asked Klaus to stay after the other trustees had loaded onto the transport. He said he wanted to show him something. He took Klaus to his truck and pulled a set of drawings from behind the seat, plans for a house he was building on the east side of Altoona, a private commission, 2 stories, full basement, everything to be done in white oak with custom joinery throughout. He spread the drawings on the truck hood and walked Klaus through them, pointing to the details with his pencil stub. explaining the joinery choices and the structural decisions and the finish specifications with the focused pleasure of a craftsman, sharing work he cared about with someone capable of understanding why he cared. Klaus looked at the drawings for a long time. He looked at the dovetail details in the staircase and the mortise and tenon specifications in the window casings and the tongue and groove pattern in the floor plan, and felt the drawings working on him in the specific way that good plans work on a craftsman, not as instructions, but as a conversation, as one craftsman's thinking made visible for another craftsman to read. He said the staircase was ambitious. Caruso said it was what the house required. Klaus said the white oak would be difficult to work in winter. Caruso said he knew. He said he was looking for someone who understood difficult wood. Klaus looked at the drawings and looked at Caruso and understood that this was not a casual conversation about house plans. He said he had worked with his father on oak, not white oak specifically, but red oak, and he understood the grain. Caruso rolled the drawings and put them back behind the seat. He said he would speak to Carol about borrowing Klaus on Saturdays for the private commission. He said Carol owed him a favor. He said Klaus would be paid in canteen script at the standard rate. He said he expected the same standard on private work as on the school. Then he drove away. Klaus stood in the empty construction site in the September evening. The school frame rose above him in the fading light, its lines clean against the sky, the work of 8 men who had been told to redo it until it was right and had done so. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. He thought about the drawings, the dovetail staircase, the white oak floors, work that required the kind of skill that did not develop in 14 months of captivity, but that had been developing in him since he was 17 years old, standing beside his father's workbench, learning that the work was either right or it was not right, and that this distinction was the only one that finally mattered. He had come to Pennsylvania weighing 119 pounds with a number on a card in his pocket. He was something else now. He was not sure yet what to call it. But it had hands that Carol had recognized and Caruso had trusted and his father had formed, and it built things that would stand for decades for people it would never meet. And the building of them was not a prisoner's work or a soldier's work, but a craftsman's work, which was the oldest and most honest kind. He walked to the road to wait for the transport back to camp. The Altoona evening was cool now with the first suggestion of the Pennsylvania autumn that Harold had warned him about. The trees along the road were beginning to turn. The light was lower than it had been in July, the shadows longer, the quality of the air carrying the particular clarity of early fall that made edges sharper and distances more precise. He stood at the road's edge and looked at the school frame against the sky, and felt something that he could not immediately name, but that had to do with the building, and with Caruso, and with the drawings behind the truck seat, and with his father's canvas pouch and Harold's sandwich and the 80 cents Mitchell had placed in his hand while looking at his face. He was still a prisoner. The transport would come and take him back behind the fence, and he would sleep in bunk 14, and wake to roll call and eat in the mess hall, and do it again tomorrow. None of that had changed. But something else had changed, or rather something had been recovered. Something that the war and the capture and the 14 months had compressed and reduced but not destroyed. Something that Caruso had identified with a 32nd of an inch, and the words "redo it until it's right." Words that were not kindness and not charity, but simply the standard, the craftsman's standard, offered to him as to any man capable of meeting it. The transport came around the corner and stopped. Klaus got in. He rode back to camp in the dark with the Pennsylvania stars above the road, and the school frame already behind him, and the white oak staircase ahead of him, and his father's hand somewhere in between. The letter from the Red Cross arrived on a Tuesday in January. Klaus was in the barracks folding his work clothes when the orderly brought it. He recognized the Red Cross envelope immediately. He had received 3 of them since capture. The first had been his mother's letter on the translucent paper. The second had been an administrative notice about prisoner mail procedures. The third was this. He sat on bunk 14 and opened it. He read it twice. His mother had died in November during an air raid on Hamburg. His brother had survived. He was living with an aunt in the countryside north of the city. He was 17 years old and attending school. Klaus folded the letter and put it in his footlocker beneath his spare shirt. He sat on the bunk and looked at the wall. The wall was the same wall it had always been. wooden planks, a nail where someone had hung something before him, a small water stain in the upper right corner from a leak that had been patched the previous fall. He had looked at this wall many times. It looked the same now as it had this morning. Ernst came in from the washroom and looked at Klaus and stopped. He said what happened. Klaus said his mother was dead. Ernst sat on his own bunk. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without elaboration, in the way of a man who understood that elaboration would not improve on the statement. Klaus said nothing. Ernst said nothing further. They sat in the barracks in the January cold, with the coal stove burning at the far end, and the Pennsylvania winter pressing against the window glass, and Klaus held the information, the way you hold something whose weight you have not yet fully registered, the way the body holds a wound in the first moments before the nerves have fully reported what has happened. He thought about her in the apartment, the blankets over the windows in winter because they could not afford curtains, the textile factory, where she had worked for 22 years, 6 days a week, her hands rough from the looms, the way she had packed his conscription bag, methodically, without crying, because crying was a use of energy she could not spare, and because she was a woman who had survived his father's death and the depression and the rise of everything that had followed, and who had learned that endurance was the only strategy that reliably worked. She had survived all of that. And then, on a night in November, an American aircraft had crossed the North Sea and found Hamburg, and his mother had not survived what came after. He understood the logic of it. Strategic bombing, civilian casualties as acceptable cost. He understood it the way you understand a mathematical proof, correctly, completely, and without the understanding doing anything to diminish what it had produced. He sat with the understanding and with what it could not reach and felt the distance between those two things, which was not a small distance. The Americans had bombed his mother. The Americans were feeding him 3 meals a day and paying him 80 cents and teaching him English and assigning him to work that Caruso called skilled labor and treated accordingly. Both of these things were true simultaneously. He did not try to resolve the contradiction. He had been trying to resolve it since he first read the newspaper articles in the camp library in August, since he had understood what the war had actually been and what Germany had actually done in the territories it had occupied, since every piece of information had added to an account that refused to resolve into anything simple enough to hold without effort. The contradiction was the truth. The truth was not simple. He had been raised in a country that insisted the truth was simple, that the categories were clear, that you knew who was right and who was wrong, and that knowing this was sufficient orientation for everything that followed. The categories were not clear. He knew this now with the specific and irreversible certainty of a man who had been on both sides of too many of them. He did not go to dinner that evening. He lay on his bunk and thought about Hamburg, the specific Hamburg of his childhood, the harbor smell on summer mornings, the particular sound of the trams on the wet streets in autumn, the light in his father's workshop in the late afternoon when the sawdust hung in the air and turned gold before settling. The Hamburg that was not the Hamburg of the newspaper articles, not the Hamburg of the Reich's administrative apparatus, not the Hamburg of what had been done in Germany's name across the continent, but the Hamburg of his mother's textile factory and his father's workbench and the cold water flat where they had been a family until they weren't. That Hamburg was gone now in multiple senses. The physical one. The bombs had seen to that. The personal one. His father in 1937. His mother in November. And the imagined one. The one he had been carrying in the letters he wrote home. The Hamburg that received his careful neutral sentences about being healthy and working and hoping to see her soon. The Hamburg that was a destination, a point toward which the arrow of his future had been aimed, even as the months accumulated, and the aim had grown less certain. That arrow had no destination now. He lay on the bunk with this information and felt it do its work. Ernst came in late and got into bed without turning on the light. In the dark, he said that he was sorry about Klaus's mother. He said it again because it was worth saying twice. Klaus said thank you. Ernst said nothing further. After a while, Ernst's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, and Klaus lay awake in the dark barracks with the coal stove clicking as it cooled and the January wind against the windows. He thought about his brother. The boy was 17. He was in the countryside with an aunt. He was attending school. He was alive. Klaus had never been particularly close to his brother, in the way of brothers with a significant age gap. He had been 9 when his brother was born, and had been more a witness to his brother's childhood than a participant in it, watching from the distance of an older sibling with his own concerns. But the boy was alive and was the only person in the world who shared Klaus's parents and his Hamburg and the specific accumulation of years that constituted a family's private history. Klaus thought about writing to him. He thought about what to say. He thought about it for a long time. Then he got up in the dark and found his writing paper on the shelf and took it to the desk at the end of the barracks, where a small lamp was always left burning, and sat down and wrote. He did not write the neutral, careful sentences he wrote to his mother. He wrote differently this time. He wrote that their mother was a woman who had endured everything the century had thrown at her without complaint, and that this was the most difficult kind of courage and the kind most easily overlooked. He wrote that he was a prisoner in Pennsylvania, and that he was being treated well, and that well was an inadequate word for what he meant. He wrote that he had been learning carpentry from an Italian-American foreman who expected the work to be right and would accept nothing less, and that this expectation had taught him more about dignity in 3 months than the previous several years combined had managed to. He wrote that he did not know yet what came after the war, but that he wanted his brother to finish school and study whatever interested him, and to understand that the study was possible, that the future was open in a way that it had not seemed open for a long time. He wrote that he loved him. He had never written this to his brother before. He was not sure he had said it directly. It was not the kind of thing their family had said directly. It was the kind of thing that was understood to exist beneath the ordinary transactions of family life without needing to be surfaced. But the ordinary transactions of family life were no longer available, and the thing that had existed beneath them needed to be surfaced now, because the alternative was leaving it where it was and hoping it was understood, which was a strategy that had worked when there was time and no longer worked when the time had been demonstrated to be finite in ways that could not be predicted. He sealed the envelope and put it on the shelf and went back to bed. In the morning, he went to the construction site. Caruso was already there in his usual way, walking the previous day's work with his coffee and his pencil stub. He looked at Klaus when Klaus arrived and looked at him in the way of a man who could read another man's face, and was doing so. He said nothing immediately. He walked the rest of his assessment and came back to where Klaus was standing and said his mother was gone. It was not a question. Klaus said yes. Caruso said he was sorry. He said his own mother had died 3 years earlier. He said it never stopped hurting, but it became manageable. He said manageable was the best word he had for it. Klaus said he would rather work. Caruso said he knew. He handed Klaus the day's plan and pointed to the window casing section that needed attention, and walked to the other end of the building to begin his own work. They worked until 5 without speaking much. At the end of the day, Caruso drove Klaus back to camp in his personal truck, rather than waiting for the transport. It was a 15-minute drive on the state road with the January fields on either side, brown and empty in the late afternoon light. Caruso talked about the white oak house, about a detail in the staircase he had been reconsidering, about a joinery approach he wanted to try that he had seen in a photograph of a house in Vermont. He talked about these things with the specific focus of a man who understood that the best thing you could offer a person in grief was not silence and not consolation, but the ordinary forward motion of the work, the reminder that the craft continued, that the next problem was already there waiting, that the hands knew what to do even when everything else was uncertain. Klaus listened and responded when he had something to contribute. Caruso dropped him at the camp gate and drove away. Klaus walked through the gate and went to the mess hall and ate dinner mechanically. He tasted nothing. He sat with Ernst and the other barracks men and ate without conversation. Nobody asked him to talk. The table understood the nature of the evening without being told. After dinner, he went to the library. He took out the Fletcher grammar book and opened it to the chapter on conditional sentences. He read the chapter twice and completed the exercises in the margins. He checked his answers against the key in the back. He got 3 wrong. He corrected them. He read the chapter a 3rd time. He did this not because English grammar required this level of attention at this particular moment, But because the grammar book was there and the lamp was on and the alternative was lying on his bunk in the dark listening to the January wind, which he was not ready for yet. By February, he had returned to the full rhythm of the work. The school's interior finish work was underway. Caruso had the crew on the classroom floors, tongue and groove white pine laid in staggered rows, with the precision of a man who understood that a school floor was not merely a floor, but the surface on which children would spend years of their lives, and that this fact imposed obligations on the people who built it. He checked every third board for gap and level. He rejected any board that had been forced into position rather than fitted, the difference being audible to his ear when he walked the floor, the forced boards producing a slightly different sound underfoot, a compression rather than a contact. Klaus heard the difference too after the first week. By the third week, he was checking his own boards before Caruso reached them, pulling the ones that sounded wrong before they needed to be pulled, fitting the replacements with the patience of someone who had internalized the standard rather than merely observed it. Caruso noticed this. He said nothing about it directly. What he said was that the east classroom floor was going faster than the west, and that Klaus should move to the west to even the pace. This was the foreman's version of a compliment, the reassignment of a good worker to the slower section, because the slower section needed the better judgment. Klaus understood this and moved to the west, and the pace evened. On Saturdays, he worked on the White Oak House. Caruso paid him in canteen script at the standard rate and expected the same standard he expected on the school, which was the only standard Caruso had. The white oak was difficult, dense and prone to splitting if the grain was not read correctly before each cut, requiring a deliberateness that Klaus had to actively maintain against the pressure of pace. He learned to read the grain by sight and by the sound of the saw entering the wood, adjusting his angle in the fraction of a second between the blade touching the surface and committing to the cut. Caruso watched him do this one Saturday morning and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that most men learn to read oak in their second year. He said it had been Klaus's first. Klaus said his father had used red oak for cabinet backs. He said the grain behavior was similar. Caruso said it was similar but not identical. Klaus said no, not identical. Caruso said his father had taught him well. Klaus said he had. They went back to work. These small exchanges were the vocabulary of their relationship, specific, technical, carrying more than their surface content. Caruso never spoke about the war. He never asked Klaus about Germany or about what Klaus had done before capture or about his beliefs. He asked about the work. He asked about the grain and the joint and the measurement and the standard. He asked whether the floor sounded right when you walked it and whether the corner was square and whether the window would hang true. The questions were the same questions he asked his civilian workers because they were the only questions relevant to what they were doing, and their universality was itself a form of statement. The statement that said the work was the work, and the man who did it was the man who did it, and the categories that the war had used to separate these two things from each other were not categories that operated in Vincent Caruso's workshop or on his construction sites. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Colonel Hargrove announced it at morning roll call. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The prisoners stood in formation in the May morning and received the information. Some men cried. Some looked at the ground. Some looked at nothing. The particular unfocused gaze of men for whom the announcement was not news but confirmation of what had been arithmetically determined years earlier. Klaus felt nothing he could name precisely. The war had ended for him at Kasserine Pass. Everything since then had been an interval, a long, strange, transforming interval that had produced things he had not expected and taken things he could not replace. But an interval nonetheless, a period defined by its suspension between two states rather than by what it was in itself, except that it had become something in itself. He knew this standing in the formation in the May morning. The interval had become a life. Not the life he had planned or been raised toward or conscripted from, but a life that had accumulated around him through 14 months of mattresses and real soap and canvas pouches and sandwiches placed without ceremony and standards enforced without cruelty, and a foreman who could hear the difference between a fitted board and a forced one and expected you to hear it too. Hargrove announced that repatriation would begin in late 1945 and continue through 1946. Priority would go to wounded prisoners and those with family obligations in Germany. He also announced that prisoners who wished to apply for immigration status could do so through camp administration. Applications would be reviewed by the State Department. Approval was not guaranteed. Klaus stood in formation and looked at the sky above the camp. It was the same blue it had been on the first evening, the untroubled blue of a sky above a country that had not been burning, that had farms and schools and families, and a carpenter in Altoona who rejected boards that sounded wrong and held his workers to the standard that made the difference between a thing built correctly and a thing built adequately, and who had treated a German prisoner of war as a craftsman because the prisoner was a craftsman, and because the work was the work, and because some standards existed independent of the categories that wars constructed and demolished. Ernst applied for immigration status the same day the announcement was made. He had been planning it since August. He had a contact at a farm 60 miles north. He had the mechanical skills that American farms increasingly required. He had the English. He had decided. Klaus applied the following morning. He wrote on the application form that he was a carpenter with 2 years of apprenticeship training and 14 months of skilled construction experience in Altoona, Pennsylvania. He listed the school building. He listed the white oak house. He listed Caruso as a reference. He submitted the form to the administration desk and walked back to the construction site where the school's interior finish was 3 weeks from completion. Caruso was at the east classroom door checking the floor for sound. He walked the length of the room with the slow, deliberate step he used for final assessment, his weight shifting from heel to ball with each step, his ear turned slightly toward the floor. He stopped at the window end and stood for a moment. He said the floor was right. Klaus said he was glad. Caruso looked at him. He said he had heard about the immigration applications. He said he had already written a letter to the State Department on Klaus's behalf. He said the letter described Klaus's work on the school and on the White Oak House and on the standards he had maintained and the rate at which he had developed beyond those standards. He said he had told them Klaus was a craftsman and that craftsmen were not common and that Pennsylvania needed them. Klaus looked at him. Caruso said he had also spoken to a contractor he knew who was building 50 houses on the north side of Altoona and needed a lead carpenter. He said the contractor's name was Morrison, and that Morrison had agreed to hold the position pending the immigration decision. Klaus said he did not know what to say. Caruso said there was nothing to say. He said Klaus should go check the west classroom floor, because the third row from the door had sounded slightly compressed yesterday, and he wanted to know if it had settled or needed to come up. Klaus went to check the floor. The immigration approval came in June. He would remain in the United States as a resident alien, path to citizenship after 5 years. He was to be released from Camp Reynolds on August 12th. He read the letter on bunk 14 where he had first pressed his hand into a real mattress and felt it compress and expand back. He looked at the water stain in the upper right corner of the wall that had been patched the previous fall. He looked at his footlocker where his mother's letter was. He looked at the shelf where his grammar books were lined up beside Fletcher's assigned texts and the 2 German novels he had checked out of the camp library and read 3 times each. He was not sure how long he sat there. Ernst came in and read his expression and said the approval had come. Klaus said yes. Ernst said his had come last week. He was going north in July. He said the farm was good. He said the woman was good too, the daughter of the farm owner, and that he was thinking about marriage. He said this in the same dry tone he used for engine diagnostics, and it was the funniest thing Klaus had heard in 2 years, and he laughed for the first time in a long time, genuinely, the laugh of a man surprised by his own capacity for it. Ernst said he was glad Klaus was staying. Klaus said he was glad too. On August 12th, Klaus walked out of Camp Reynolds at 8 in the morning. He had entered on June 12th, 1944, weighing 119 pounds. He left weighing 187 pounds. He carried a duffel bag. Inside it were civilian clothes that Caruso had brought him the previous Friday. Work trousers, 2 cotton shirts, a canvas jacket, work boots still stiff with newness. There was a photograph of his mother taken before the war, standing outside the textile factory in her good coat, squinting slightly into the sun. There were the letters from his brother, tied with a piece of string his brother had included in one of the envelopes without explanation. There were Fletcher's grammar books, which he had purchased from the camp administration for 50 cents. There was a small piece of white oak from the house on the east side of Altoona. A cutoff from the staircase railing, the grain running in a long clean arc from one end to the other, the surface smooth from the plane. He kept the oak piece because it was the right grain, because he had learned to read this kind of grain over the winter at Caruso's side, because it was the first white oak he had worked, and it had been difficult, and he had worked it correctly, and Caruso had said so, which was the form that Caruso's acknowledgments took, and which was sufficient. Caruso was waiting outside the gate with his truck. He drove Klaus to a boarding house 3 blocks from the construction site where Morrison's houses were going up. The room was on the 2nd floor with a window overlooking a tree-lined street. A bed, a dresser, a desk, a sink. Clean and plain and entirely his own. He unpacked his duffel. He set the photograph of his mother on the dresser. He set Fletcher's grammar books on the desk. He set the piece of white oak on the windowsill where the morning light would find the grain. He sat on the bed and looked around the room. He thought about the transit camp in New Jersey, the British holding camps in North Africa, the truck that had brought him to Altoona through a town where a man had glanced at the canvas and kept walking because the day was simply a Tuesday, and the town was simply a town, and nothing was required of a person except to move through it in the direction they were already going. He thought about the mattress on bunk 14, and the real soap and the 80 cents, and the canvas pouch, and Harold's sandwich, and Carol's observation about the hands and Caruso's 32nd of an inch. He thought about his mother finishing the bread on whatever afternoon she had received whatever news had arrived in whatever year of the war, because the bread needed finishing regardless. He thought about his brother in the countryside finishing school. He would write to him this evening. He would tell him where he was, and what he was doing, and who Caruso was, and what the white oak house looked like, and what it felt like to build a school floor that sounded right when you walked it. He would tell him that the country was large, and the sky was enormous, and the people in it were not what anyone had told them the people would be. He would tell him that dignity was not something that nations distributed to their citizens, but something that existed in the specific and daily transactions between people who chose to extend it, that it lived in canvas pouches and extra sandwiches and floors that needed to be redone until they were right. He would tell him to come if he ever wanted to. He would tell him there was room. He started work the following Monday at 7 in the morning. Morrison's site was 3 blocks north. He walked there in the cool August air with his tools in the canvas bag Caruso had given him. Handsaw, hammer, combination square, marking gauge, pencil stub, and he arrived to find Morrison already walking the framing with his coffee and his eye. Morrison looked at him and looked at the framing and handed him the plans for the day. Klaus unrolled them and read them the way his father had taught him to read plans, starting from the foundation and working up, understanding the load path before the detail, the whole before the part. He identified the section he would be responsible for and folded the plans to that section and went to work. He measured twice. He cut once. He checked the result. He was a craftsman in Altoona, Pennsylvania, on a street being built for people he would never meet who would expect it to hold, and it would hold, and he would see to it that it would hold. Because that was what the work required, and because he had been told by a man who knew what the work required, that redo it until it's right was not a punishment but a standard, and the standard was not the Foreman standard, or the prisoner's standard, or the German standard, or the American standard, but simply the craftsman's standard, which was the oldest one, which was the one that his father had carried in a canvas pouch in the left drawer of a workbench in Hamburg, which had crossed an ocean in the hands of a man who had been many things, and was now, on a Monday morning in August in Pennsylvania, simply a man with a square and a saw and a plan, building something that would stand